All right, welcome back to another episode of Creedal Catholic. Today, I'm speaking to Amar Patel, and I'm very excited for this conversation. This is timely. We are in the weeks running up to the 2020 presidential election, and Amar Patel is actually himself running on the vice presidential the presidential ticket as the vice presidential candidate for the American Solidarity Party. So, Amar, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you. I've been a fan of the American Solidarity Party for quite some time. I've done a few podcast episodes already discussing the choices before us in the two major parties in America, and it's really not a heartening sight. So I'm really excited to talk to you about some alternative visions, thinking about political possibility beyond the Republican-Democrat binary and the policy platforms of the American Solidarity Party, and et cetera. So welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have you. I'm going to read your bio here, Amar, so our listeners can get a sense of who you are and what your background is. And then if you don't mind, we'll just dive right in and talk a little bit about your party and why you're running and what the end goal is and what you think about our future. So
that sounds great.
Great. So here's the bio for my listeners. Amar Patel was born to Indian immigrants who came to this country in the late 1960s. His father worked as a civil engineer for the city of Chicago, and his mother worked as a union laborer in cleaning supply factory. His parents sponsored the immigration of many family members during his childhood, and he grew up with several aunts, uncles, and cousins in his family home at once. He received bachelor's degrees in math, chemistry, and psychology, and a master's in education from the University of Illinois. After meeting his wife at the Newman Center during college, they moved to the Chicago suburbs, where they have been teachers for the last 20 years. They have 2 children in high school. Amar has spent years on many committees for school and curriculum development, given talks at state conferences, worked on several church councils, and organized major speech competitions. He has coached speech team, math team, tennis, golf, soccer, and basketball. He serves his community through the Knights of Columbus and other local organizations. He is a published novelist, lead singer for a band, member of a competitive softball team. All right, I like that. But his passion is in building community and bringing people together. So, Amar, that's a long introduction. I wanted to do the whole thing, though, because I think it's important to understand where you're coming from and also to understand that you're here running for vice president of the United States on a third-party ticket, the American Solidarity Party. But it's not as if you have spent your entire career as a political operative. You have been doing a lot of things that sort of the everyday American has done. And I imagine that gives you a really keen insight into the concerns of everyday Americans.
Yeah, I definitely think that, having the chance to not, after graduating college and going into what we would say real life, as you and most listeners are experiencing, and diversifying, who I hang out with. And you mentioned I play softball, and do you play softball, Zach?
I do. It's been a few years, but I used to play on a competitive team, and it was a ton of fun. I substituted for a friend last year over the summer once, and let's just say I was a little rusty. I had to shake the rust off a bit.
Right. But I mean, that was probably one of the things, that experience for, and I still play, and I still have the same friends that I've played competitive ball with, and we just play on league night. But really, that gave me a diversity of viewpoints more than anything else in my life. I mean, going to university, you get stuck in the same kind of people you hang out with. I was very involved in the Newman Center, which means, my friends were mainly Catholic and devout, we'd go to daily mass. It just was a very, very common. We had a common set of beliefs. And then, working in a school setting, even though people had different faiths, you don't really talk about your faith too much in a public school setting, but you have a similar mindset. You're all professionals, and you all kind of had the same training. For me, it was math teachers. And so when I started playing softball, it really gave me a real wide look at how lots of different people live their lives in different ways. But at the same time, core values were very, very similar across different faiths. People that did not practice any faith, blue collar workers, white collar workers, people who did not have jobs but just loved the game, and maybe were living with their parents or with a friend or whatever, and just experience what they experienced through their eyes. Really made me understand that how, first of all, how blessed I was to go through the experience of my own life, but at the same time to, stand in what we call ourselves the American Solidarity Party. Solidarity often is called, realizing that we're all in this together. But I think even a deeper principle in Catholic social teaching, it's about recognizing other people as brothers and sisters. And, from playing competitive softball for a long time, I mean, these are guys I consider my brothers, and we went through a lot of tough games together and traveled together, talked about our family lives and just, the sorrows and joys and passions that people had. And I really got a sense of that kind of extended brotherhood. And then when they were in need, I felt compelled to be in solidarity with them. So a lot of kind of shared tears and work time and helping people move and all that kinds of stuff that you would imagine.
Well, I love that. And one of the reasons why I mentioned just your background and sort of your familiarity with everyday Americans like me and my listeners, right? It's important, I think, to have someone who's on a national ticket who understands those things. I mean, I remember when we had the 2016 election, and there were claims that Hillary Clinton was the most qualified candidate ever to run for the office, because she had been first lady, so she knew the pressures of the executive job. She had been a senator for 8 years. She was Secretary of State under President Obama, et cetera. And then on the other hand, you have Trump, who's running as a total outsider, et cetera. But to pretend or imagine that either of these candidates is familiar with the plight of the American worker, the concerns of the single mom who's trying to make ends meet for her 4 kids, the young family who is living below minimum wage and trying to scrape enough money together to put beans and rice on the table yet again for dinner. To pretend that either candidate really understood that is completely ridiculous. And so it's really refreshing to see someone on a national party ticket who has not spent their entire life in policy, who is not, has not made millions of dollars in real estate transactions across the world, et cetera. And even like Biden, I mean, I think Biden this time around in 2020 has successfully, to some degree, pitted himself as the blue collar candidate. But he's been in the Senate since, until 2009, from 1973 to 2009, and then obviously the vice presidency, and that ended in 2016. But I mean, this person also very out of touch with everyday Americans. So that's great. And I love how you bring that perspective of solidarity, viewing your fellow Americans as brothers and sisters with you. So let's pull that thread a little bit and talk to me a little bit more about solidarity. When I heard of this party several years ago, the American Solidarity Party, I immediately thought of the solidarity movement in Europe in the end of the Cold War era. And John Paul II's Poland was very involved in that, and the solidarity movement, led by young people in many cases, successfully pushed back against communism. Do you have an idea of how much the American Solidarity Party sort of identifies with those principles that animated that movement in Europe?
Well, I think, since Christian democratic principles, our solidarity, subsidiarity, personalism, and sphere sovereignty, traditionally from those European movements, that when we wanted to form, we did start the party earlier in 2012 when several people got together and wanted to form an American Christian Democratic Party. And when we incorporated in 2016 officially, I mean, that was kind of more an idea back in those days. But when the papers were drawn up and we actually did all the FEC filing so that we could have a presidential candidate, they said they went with the American Solidarity Party for that reason, right? To identify with the Polish Solidarity movement, but also to signify that, yes, that is a core principle coming from traditional Christian democracy that still flourishes in Europe and in South America and a couple of other countries around the world. And we often, people lament, why isn't there a equivalent party in the United States? And I think that's that our founders wanted to do. And so, one of the things I teach high school math, and right now today we had an institute day where we really spent a lot of time preparing for hybrid, learning. We've been on remote teaching platform right now every day where the kids are at home and we're in the building, and we're preparing to have some of the kids come back, and broken up and having a limited number of students in the building. And one of the things that we talked about repeatedly was the building of relationships and connections. And so being together with someone, on equal footing and with the students and kind of sharing with them space, and that's where you can then share more emotional connections and more, like that relationship that you can build with a student to let them know you really care. It's just so hard to do through Zoom. And I think people that we were talking about, we didn't talk about solidarity per se, but the word relationship came up a lot. And I think, one of the things that in this campaign that I've pushed for is a concept that we're the only party that talks about family, friends, and faith being the core realities for people. And then when you try to force the freedom of individualism upon people, like the main two parties do in their own ways, each in a different kind of pursuit, that they're really undercutting what makes people tick, which is solidarity in those environments, family, friends, and faith.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about there, but I want to identify and sort of tease out a little bit more about this Zoom comment that you made and the importance of building relationships and how hard that is to do over Zoom sometimes. Now, I served in the military for a while, deployed, et cetera, all that. So I'm well aware of how video conferencing technologies can really be a means of keeping connections intact, et cetera, right? And I think all of us who have used these to some degree or another, kids Skyping grandparents from across the country, separated spouses, whatever. I mean, these technologies can be helpful, but they're not a replacement for real person-to-person contact. And I think it's sad that, of all the times for a pandemic to hit us in which we have to be physically separated, it's at a time when our national tensions are running so high. I would also suggest, though, that these digital technologies that we use, most especially social media, so not even now Zoom and Skype, but just social media in general, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, whatever, those things really actively cut against, I think, an idea of human flourishing that views people as brothers and sisters. And what they've been able to do is just develop this incredibly toxic culture in which we literally are just teaching ourselves to hate each other. And I see this magnified in the 2020 campaigns of both the Republican and Democratic parties. And, throughout every avenue of social media in which I look, people who are on opposing sides of the bipartisan divide just view the other side as less than human. And these debates just become so wrapped up with vitriol and complete poison. And so it's really refreshing to have a party like yours that comes in and says, we're all in this together. And we are guided by these four principles that, like you said, really are sort of, they're in alignment with Christian democratic parties in Europe, which is a different thing than the modern Democratic Party in the United States, a very different thing. But I think that's really, really important. So you mentioned these four things: solidarity, subsidiarity, personalism, and sphere sovereignty. So I want to unpack that for my listeners here, because I think that encapsulates, or at least gives a lot of the grounding for the ASP platform. So let's talk about each of those in turn, if you don't mind. So you talked about solidarity a little bit already, seeing each other as, in a fraternal way, brothers and sisters. Let's talk about subsidiarity. What do you mean by subsidiarity?
Yeah, I think the Catholic concept of that, and I think just in definitional and usage, a good way to frame that ASP member recently brought up was, it's the understanding that you want government to be as small as possible, but as big as necessary. If that turn of a phrase, it works for people, I think that's the best way I've seen it put, because you just don't want small government. Like the libertarian notion that just get rid of government and everything we find is nonsensical, especially since government is so tangled into our lives right now, and the tentacles are everywhere, that you can't just remove that without causing grave damage to some of the support structures and the way things operate. I mean, just it's too much of a behemoth at this point. At the same time, you do want to try to get things down to a more local and intimate level, so that whoever is spending the money, whoever is making those calls and the decisions that need to be made that are going to impact people's lives, you would like that to be as local as possible. And so that is the concept that the Catholic Church has used in its own structure. With the idea of the family being the domestic church, and the first educators of children, and the first teachers of the faith,
right?
Defenders of the faith, and then you break off into your parishes and obviously the diocese and so forth. It grows from there, and that model is kind of what you would say that the federalism works at, when you have the federal government, and again you have state governments and townships. But I mean, things have gotten, as you were saying, it's just the vitriol, because the government has centralized to DC in such a way that these national, especially the presidency, becomes this overarching force that we have to deal with every 4 years, because that's just the size of the government and the impact that it has in our lives. Whereas, and that's really a perception, to be honest, right? I mean, that's not necessarily true. Your local government still does so much, but we don't think about it that way. And so no one cares about your local activities, and everyone freaks out about the presidency every 4 years.
That's so true. I had a discussion a couple weeks ago on this podcast where I was just saying I really am a huge fan of down ballot voting, because those smaller elections, your local governments, municipal governments, state governments, in many cases, can have a much bigger impact on your life than the federal government. But we have turned this thing into this is the most consequential election of our lives because of these two people at the top of the ticket. Well, there's a lot of people in between the top of the ticket and you. And so all the issues that get handled at lower levels, they also need good people in those seats who are making those decisions and carrying out those policies. So that's a great point. I also like your point about the libertarian conception. I mean, when I articulated publicly a few weeks ago that I would not be voting for either major candidate in this election, someone asked me, why not Joe Jorgensen, the libertarian candidate? And my response was that, to me, libertarian philosophy, libertarian thought does not have an adequate conception of the common good, and that's why I can't support it. But I really appreciate how the American Solidarity Party is very clear about articulating what that common good looks like. And that leads me to the third one. So we talked about solidarity, brothers and sisters. Subsidiarity, government is as small as it can be while being as big as it needs to be. And then now we're at personalism. So what is personalism?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that actually in your beginning discussion about human flourishing, and then the understanding that human flourishing doesn't happen in either of the ways that the two major parties or the libertarians propose. And especially in the economic world, in the worldview, where the Republicans will kind of push this idea of rugged individualism, and that the market, that the market forces and your impact in the market, that's really where you will flourish.
The invisible hand guides all, Amar.
Yes. That is exactly in the sense that the purpose of life and of your job is to create and to consume, create, and amass capital, right? And then that is not how human beings flourish. And the opposite side would be the concept of, if not socialism, but even like the large government, regulated economy, the command economy, if you will, where everyone just does their part, and you're just a cog in a large machine. That if you do your bit, then the government will make things work out for you, and that you will be successful in that vein. And again, that neither of those things provides that level of human flourishing, where we know, and as I discussed before, that you flourish in your family, with your community, and in your deeper organizations like churches and social organizations. Like, that's where people really find true meaning and true happiness. And then your workplace is a place also to find meaning, but it's not the place to find meaning. And it's just a way to get you to those, to allow you to have the freedom to experience those other things that truly provide you, the dignity of your life.
That's great. So that's the first three then. And then the fourth you mentioned is sphere sovereignty. So what is that, to round out this sort of the foundation of the platform here?
Yeah, so sphere sovereignty, that was new to me. The other three I kind of had a good grasp on as a Catholic, but that sphere sovereignty is more of a Kuyperian thing, Calvinist thought. But if you think about a subsidiarity being trying to as small as possible, as big as necessary, sphere sovereignty, and if you think about the idea of a sphere, I'm a math teacher, is that there's certain things in our lives, like for example, education, that has, like, there's experts in that. So I have a degree, a master's in education, and I work with people who are also experts, and we collaborate and make decisions for our students and within our school or whatever. But then at the same time, if you think about like No Child Left Behind in the Bush era, and just like those Race to the Top and things like that, where the government starts to creep into spheres, also being like the church and even media, and just all these different places where they have their own dignity, they have their own purpose in life that go with solidarity, subsidiarity, and personalism, that should be enhancing that, and that the government, the principles of the purpose of government is not to interfere, right? Is to try to stay out of that as long as justice is being served, by those entities that they should be able to operate on their own without that kind of, outside force.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. And to my listeners, Amar mentioned Kuyperian. That's a reference to the work of Abraham Kuyper, who was a neo-Calvinist theologian. He was prime minister of the Netherlands from 1901 to 1905, I think. So really a remarkable thinker and simultaneously a theologian and a statesman, showing perhaps a blueprint for how we can marry some of these ideas with statecraft, which I think is a really important thing. Sure. And I want to dive into some of those more specific things about the platform, some of the sort of policy things for which the American Solidarity Party platform as it stands now is advocating for, Amar. But before we do that, I think maybe an obvious question, I'm sure one that you fielded before, is why run? What is the end goal here, right? I think you guys are officially on the ballot in less than 10 states. Is that correct?
I think it's 9 states and write-in and about 30 other ones.
Okay.
There are some gaps around the country where either the write-in process or the ballot access was either impossible or very, very difficult with COVID got in the way of several tries and that sort of thing. But why run is a great question. You're right. I feel that very often.
Yeah, and I'm on your side here, by the way. I wrote a couple years ago. I wrote a defense of third-party voting. So I think there's a virtue in and of itself. I think voting itself is a moral act. I think you should only vote for positive goods, et cetera. So I you don't need to convince me, but I'm certainly open to learning more, and I'm sure there are more reasons that I haven't thought of. So from your perspective, as someone who's running as the vice presidential candidate for a party that has a statistically negligible a chance of winning a national election, why do it at all? What's the end goal?
Well, I'll tell you that one thing that people need to keep in mind is that the two parties don't serve everyone, right? There's definitely people who and most people are not in exactly the camps of one of the two major candidates, or even in their realm of ideological, like their viewpoints. And so there's people in their orbits that kind of would gravitate to one or the other very clearly, but there's like a idea of an axis of two major concerns, one being economic, one being social, and that traditionally people would say that the Democrats have a liberal economic viewpoint and a liberal social viewpoint, and the Republicans are conservative in both. And what I've come to kind of try to get people to understand is that it's just not true.
100% agree. Yeah, completely right.
Right. That the liberal economic viewpoint is what we would say is conservative. It's that free market notion. And the words have been butchered so badly, almost that itself would be enough reason for me to run, just so we use those words correctly.
Right.
But this concept of freedom from coercion has become the mantra. I mean, that's the libertarian mantra in a total. Like the true liberals are the libertarians, and they have the perfect name for it.
Yep.
Is that they don't want to be free means that you have no one telling you what to do. In a nutshell, and then there's obviously deeper libertarian thought, and some of it's pretty well thought out for an academic, but in reality, those are the ideas of a teenager, right? You can't tell me what to do is what my teens would say when I would try to tell them, well, this is what's good for you, this is what's good for you, this is what's good for our family. No, you can't tell me what to do. I'm not free. You're enslaving me. And whereas a traditional sense of freedom is not so much just being able to do what you want to do, but having the ability to do what you ought to do, right? Like the classical Greek Christian understanding of freedom is very much more in that vein of being able to control your own vices, right? Your humanity, so that you can work towards virtue. And so,
yeah, the most simple way that I've heard that broken down, that distinction made, is on the one hand, we're talking about freedom from, right? Freedom from oppression, yes. Freedom from rules. On the other hand, we're talking about freedom for. You are now free to flourish in your life in these ways.
That's right. So negative rights versus positive rights. I think you would appreciate that terminology then, if you know that other terminology. Exactly. And so what people fail to understand, and research has shown that like around 30% of Americans really have an economic populism in their mindset, that they want economic justice. They don't want to have the wealth inequality that we have. and the income inequality that we have. They would like to see a lot more small business and a lot less corporate structure, and the economic rents that exist in all those venues. But at the same time, they're also socially center right, and so they're not, kind of in the what people would say the progressive side of the Democratic Party. They really look at that and shake their heads and go, "This is not right for human flourishing." So that 30% of the population, every 4 years, if we're going to talk about a presidential election cycle, they have to pick, right? They're the ones that have to vote for the lesser of two evils. And there's just so many of those people.
Well, and that means, I mean, that's basically a plurality, right? Because I'm just thinking about this offhand and sort of making up numbers, but I imagine there's probably 10% sort of fringe right, 10% fringe left,
Right.
and then you have 25% sort of traditional Republican, 25% traditional Democrat. And so that 30% ends up being the plurality that actually determines
Yes.
the direction.
Well, in one of the studies that I really have dug into recently, the big news in 2016 was that President Trump won the economic populist conservative social group 3-1.
Wow.
That was the margin. He took that from Hillary Clinton. She was just such a noxious, candidate that over his own noxious behavior, that people in that group tilted in his direction, probably because he made himself appear to be a populist economic supporter of blue collar workers. Like that whole, we're going to bring back coal jobs, and we're going to bring back, we're going to have fracking, and we're going to these towns that have lost all their industrial capacity, we're gonna start that up again, right? Like people believed that was going to happen, and that whether or not those people will vote again for President Trump remains to be seen. But he dominated that part of the population, and we just barely had started, so our candidate was a blip in that section. This time we're going to have a significant more role in that, and people say, well, you're going to tilt the election one way or another. No, we're not. I mean, it's people we should split that vote of people who know about us and feel compelled to vote their conscience instead of holding their nose and going one way or another. But I think the people who do go for one of the main two will split, because there's really no reason to go either way. If you live in that quadrant of the political plane, you're almost coming down to some like one decision, and I don't think there's a uniform decision people make on that.
Yeah, totally understood. And I think your argument makes sense. I also think, just in addition to just giving people some way to vote their conscience, giving people the idea that there is a better way out there. We can call it a third way, a better alternative, a more healthy vision, whatever. But just giving them the idea that that's possible, I think can pay dividends in the future. But I'm wondering what the strategy of the American Solidarity Party looks like for the future. Because as I think about this, if I'm thinking, how can we incorporate these ideas into American life? It's not with a national ticket that gets less than 1% of the vote. To me, it's identifying and training and equipping local candidates to implement these ideas at the local level and then build up from that. And I can imagine, 10, 15 years hence, I can imagine if you do that, a state governor becoming, being elected from the American Solidarity Party, because you concentrated your resources in one part of the country, perhaps, several municipalities in one state. You work kind of at the municipal level in elections there, and really kind of polished your platform at that level for those people, and we're able to articulate that vision. So is that part of the conversation going forward, or is your plan to keep the conversation kind of at the national level?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's 100% correct. I think the biggest thing as we're starting to grow and we get more and more people interested, and I was the vice chair and then the chair for the last 2 years. I still got a lot of those kind of conversations, hours and hours of discussing with people, and then even people outside the party that are thinkers in this particular. And what I would say, and again, I'm not speaking for the party on this particular idea, but really we are discussing post-liberal concepts, right? We're talking about
Definitely.
the concept that individual freedoms are not the only thing that are important, and you have to balance that with the responsibility you have in solidarity with your brothers and sisters. And so that resonates with not just the 30% of people who already fall in our space, but like you said, the people that aren't quite Democrats or Republicans are kind of on the fringe of those mindsets. That how quickly would they turn coat and come to a much more comfortable, much more just space if there was an option, right? And I think if you go back into the several decades before we started fracturing into these camps that are so divided and have such a big chasm between them, that I would suspect, if there was a way to go back and ask those people, what their philosophies were, that most people, or many, even more than 30%, would have fallen in a populist economic and socially conservative viewpoint, and that because the two parties have gone their ways, that they've been slowly, getting pulled, kind of like in a Stockholm syndrome manner, where they just start identifying with their captors and getting talking points that don't actually fit their natural worldview. And when I hear Christians talk about capitalism, and I don't mean like a free market, I mean like just the corporate capitalism and the greed, the love of money, as a good, as like not just something that's a necessary thing that stops us from having socialism, let's say, but it's specifically a good. Is I say, that's still greed. When the economy is built and the bottom line is the functional reason for any economic activity, that you should look at that as a Christian and be very concerned. But when people defend it as a good, I see that as Stockholm syndrome, that you've now taken on the mindset of Republicans because they're pro-life, for example, or for religious freedom or family values or whatever it is, that reason that you would vote that way, that you start listening to everything they talk about.
Yeah, it could be Stockholm. It also could be, and I've seen this in conversations with other people who are very kind of pro-free. I mean, I'm pro-free market, right? But I mean, like in the sort of traditional Republican sense, these people kind of defend capitalism as like a necessary evil by saying that it's true that it works because it appeals to the greed in every human, but without that, we would have so many people in poverty. And because a rising tide lifts all boats, it's good that we have really greedy people who are really after money, because that gives other people jobs. And I think that's going too far, obviously, in defense of that, right? To say that private ownership of capital is good, the ability for private enterprise and free enterprise is good. That's a different thing than defending the sort of greed of oligarchs at the top of the economy.
Exactly. And people, part of it is that people just don't know enough to see that background occur, like how economic rent dominates the whole process, that it isn't really a free market, that the market is very rigged, and that, especially when you talk about income inequality and wealth inequality, that there's lots of strings that are attached there that you're not allowed to flow freely, in your environment. So, that's one of the things that I think your first question was like, what is the vision going forward? Is like, well, first you have to get people to
think about it.
Just to think about it, right?
Yeah.
Just to reflect, to have that self-reflection. I think your freedom, from and versus the freedom for. I mean, just that concept alone. When I challenge people to consider what they feel freedom is, most people will start with freedom from. And I'll say that, yeah, but
I think it's because of our unique American identity. We think, America based on freedom. What kind of freedom? Freedom from the tyrant King George, right? And so then every conception of freedom that we have post 1776 becomes that kind of freedom.
Correct. It's all framed that way. And I think when Patrick Deneen is a Notre Dame professor, and I had opportunities. He wrote Why Liberalism Failed. And he just talks about, and it's very compelling that when people get to that point, I said, well, here's the problem, is that when your deepest desire with regards to freedom is to be free from, some kind of constraint, and that's your passion, like, and that's your goal, then as you start cutting constraints, you start cutting off people, right? You start cutting off your relationships, because in the end of the day, the biggest constraints that you will ever have are the people that you are beholden to, the responsibilities that you have to your closest people, first of all, But then even, when you cut those away, you really then quickly lose sense of any responsibility to further people. I mean, they're not even in your house, So when you think of the responsibility to the poor, and having a preferential option for the poor, like that just becomes, a complete abstraction as opposed to something that should be seriously taken as a first principle.
Yeah, you're so right. And I love how the platform itself builds itself around this idea of personalism, this idea that we are all beholden to each other, that humans are social animals. Just yesterday, I was having a conversation with a colleague who was talking about euthanasia and making the case for why euthanasia should be an acceptable option if someone is at the end of their life and just wants to go out on their own terms. And I was trying, probably not well, but I was trying to illustrate this alternative vision that none of us exist in isolation from one another. None of us are atomistic individuals. None of us can make a decision that's simply on our own terms like that. And that's one reason among many why euthanasia is simply not acceptable policy outcome. And so speaking of policy outcomes, in the time we have remaining, I know we don't have a ton of time, but I'd like to ask you a few kind of specific questions about the platform itself. So I'm on the American Solidarity Party website, and I see it broken into 6 different sections: life and family, civil rights, economics, civic engagement and public service, foreign policy and immigration, and environment. So let's just maybe pick a couple of those, starting with the life and family section. I love how, one, you just talk about the importance of family here, and you already mentioned Catholic social teaching, how the family is the domestic church, it is the bedrock of society, it is the baseline structure of subsidiarity. It's really important for governments to strengthen families. I think that's incredibly important. You also mention education, which I think is a great thing to include in a party platform, in a national party platform, because education is incredibly important, and we've done it incredibly poorly for the last several decades in this country. So can you talk a little bit more about the education platform of the American Solidarity Party?
Yeah, that's something obviously that's near and dear to me as a public school educator and someone who has spent time in Catholic schools. And my kids went to Catholic school until ours closed, and then they spent their time in public school themselves. That I obviously have spent an entire lifetime, professional lifetime in my adulthood, really being involved in this sphere. And I think one of the things from the teacher perspective is that we spend a lot of time as educators in staff development, coming up with strategies to get information to students. Even through relationships, of course, but even like in our pedagogy, how do we get the kids to learn this or that? And I think we get really bent out of shape and tie ourselves into knots into that shape, trying to overcome serious inequities in achievement and where kids come into the building and how they leave the building in terms of what they are able to accomplish. And I think that connection between family and education is just so critically important that, whatever we can do in the short time we have with a child in front of us in the classroom, it's just a tiny fraction of what that child experiences and the learning that they get and the value for living in the moment and taking ownership of their learning and their growing as a person, right? That flourishing idea. I mean, so much of that happens in the family. So that when you talk about education, it is appropriate for it to be in the life and family section because, your first educator, so your first educators are your parents, and then one of the things in this country that we fail to extend or have is an acknowledgement of the power of extended families. How people, because of our business setting and because of how our economy works, people move. There's just so much transience in family life that you might move away from your grandparents, and from your aunts and uncles and cousins. And so how many people are, as you said, like atomized in nuclear families when that very rarely occurs around the world, right? And from my own cultural, in my bio that you read, I had multiple aunts and uncles and cousins living in my house as I grew up. And the richness of that education, really helped my own education, not just because they were all very positive about education and were very always asking me how school was and helping me if I had problems, but just the richness of having adults always around to talk to. And, it makes you mature faster. It makes you flourish in your own way because you have multiple different mindsets, worldviews, personalities that you're always constantly dealing with, and so obviously like those elements come into play in education. And then as a party that believes in sphere sovereignty, and you have the world of education, and then you have public schools and you have private schools. We have a lot of members who homeschool their kids and having a respect for that. Whereas if I'm coming from a public school setting, oftentimes public school teachers who have really, they don't have any friends that are homeschoolers. They did not go to school with anyone and that experienced homeschooling, that they kind of just automatically poo-poo that idea that it's inferior, to a quality public school education. Like, how can someone who's not a professional teach as well as I can? Well, because they have the deep relationship. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, I have to say, I was homeschooled all the way through. Just about. I had a semester of public school, and yeah, while it's true that professionally trained teachers can do great things in the classroom in public school or private school, it's also true that they don't know any child, any student like the loving parent in the home does.
Exactly. And there's just so it all comes back to that first level depth of relationship that parents and family members, and then your neighbors. We've lost our touch with neighbors, and that one of the things I remember distinctly growing up is when my parents would have me call my neighbors. Now we were kind of the only Indian family in our neighborhood, and it was a blue collar white neighborhood. And I would call, I remember, call them Uncle Steve and, Aunt Ruth or whatever, whoever our neighbors were. And I'm like, they're not my uncles. There's no way they're my uncles, but that was the culture. That was an extension, like an Uber extension of your family, right? That your neighborhood was a level of importance to life. And so I think that kind of helps your education as well, because you don't just learn in the classroom. Like, learning is constant, and it gives you that respect that moments are cherished. And so I have so many students that, because of the breakdown in their own family lives, when they come to school, it's just a drudgery. It's just something else to go through, to get through, to survive. Right? They're in survival mode as opposed to flourishing mode.
Yeah, I have a friend who teaches high school math, actually. You said you're a math teacher as well, right?
I'm a math teacher. Yes.
Yeah, so I have a friend who teaches high school math in a sort of depressed socioeconomic neighborhood, and her stories are really, really sad. And the school is either an escape for her students, or, like you said, just another thing that sort of is an added stressor to them. They end up dropping out after 9th or 10th grade, et cetera. And that's horrible.
Right.
So another thing I wanted to talk about real quick, we're in an amazing year here. I've learned so much about criminal justice, about racism, about the experience of people of color in our country, especially in the criminal justice system. And so I've tried to take the opportunity over the past months to learn more about this as we're having this national conversation about it. And I think that, both Democratic and Republican kind of policy solutions for these things miss the mark. And I was reading through the criminal justice stuff in the American Solidarity Party platform, and I was just impressed with what's in here. So I'm just going to read for my listeners a couple of excerpts that struck me, and then we can talk about it just a little bit more. Maintaining public peace and order is a fundamental responsibility of government. However, in too many cases, our justice system is both harsh and ineffective. Despite having the largest incarcerated population in the world, we have failed to make communities safe or adequately address economic and racial disparities in arrests, convictions, and sentencing. Continuing on here in a different section of that same part of the platform. Criminality is complex, the result of a culture that does not respect human life, the breakdown of traditional social institutions, institutionalized racism, and a prison system that promotes social alienation, recidivism, and deprivation. We believe that preventing and punishing crime is an essential public service. We believe that our court system systematically disfavors the poor. We believe that prisons are designed for dangerous criminals. Mandatory sentencing requirements must be overturned. Drug addiction remains a social harm. It is vital to find ways of ending mass incarceration while not removing all laws against drugs and other vices. And then this is one of the most interesting to me. It is also vital to recognize the social costs of pornography, which is inseparable from human trafficking, the promotion of pedophilia, and rape. We therefore support laws which criminalize the production and sale of pornography and deny categorically that pornography is protected speech. So I love everything that I just read there, Amar. And I think what it does is strike a balance between, one, recognizing that public policing or that policing is a public good, an essential public service in the words of this platform. Two, that we need to have criminal laws and enforce criminal laws. But then on the other hand, that all of our punitive efforts need to also be restorative. We need to focus on the social ills that lead to these things. Elsewhere in here, you mentioned community-led policing. You look at things that would fall into this category of freedom from, like pornography, for example, as being on the wrong side of the freedom for equation. These things actually suppress our freedom. They harm human flourishing, and that is why they should be criminalized, et cetera. They lead to even worse things like human trafficking. And so I love the way you strike a sort of via media, a third way between the sort of tough on crime stance of the traditional stereotypical Republican and the so-called soft on crime. Every instance of enforced penal code is an example of like systematic disenfranchisement or not disenfranchisement, just being disadvantaged or targeted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate those compliments, and I think that people, that we pride ourselves in having both and approaches to these issues, where the main parties will just quibble over things. And someone actually just in Twitter the other day said that we were the moralists that could not make trade-offs in our policy. Like there was no way that moralists like us that have this high ground that we're taking could ever have a give or take. And I said, well, that's what the main parties do, right?
Yeah,
like
that's so silly.
Yeah, so that's where the moralists dwell, because they can never give up any of their prideful claims about this is the only way and this is the right way. And so that both end mentality, I think, it goes back to the idea of Christian democracy. And for me, this particular part of our platform and reflecting on kind of the race issues that we've had throughout the summer is that idea of going back to when you want to have some kind of reconciliation, that there needs to be a penance. And for your Catholic listeners, I think people think of the sacrament of reconciliation, that there is that penitential component. And we've never had that suffering. Those in power have never suffered to restore the relationships that they to the people that they disenfranchised or took power away from. Albert Thompson's on the National Committee, and he had a great speech to the Anglican Bishops' Council, and he tells historically there was a time where during the Civil War, the Southern bishops broke from the Northern bishops during the Civil War of the Anglican, church, and they actually promoted slavery as a religious good. Like they used the Bible to defend the Southern notion of slavery. And then once the war was over, after a short period of time, the Northern bishops accepted the Southern bishops right back in, and there was no penance. There was maybe a tiny mea culpa, but there was never really a making right of that horrible wrong that happened, right? And so when you talk about being reparative, that no relationship in your own life is reparative simply, I hope it's not simply by saying that you're sorry, right? That there has to be showing that you're sorry, making amends in some way to heal the pain that you've caused. Otherwise, the pain lingers. It doesn't go away. And so in your own marriage, in spats you would have with like older kids, little kids might forget, but if you have those major massive battles with your junior high or high school level kids and you don't repair that relationship, that's going to linger. That animosity will stay, and that child will not have a healthy relationship with you. Same thing's true at work, in your neighborhood, and then all that spills off. And we're the government is a group of people, right? And so when you have prisoners and society, parts of our society that are broken off from us, there needs to be that reconciliation. And in my way of speaking, I always say there's got to be a time where you carry that cross with them, that they're carrying on their own right now. When are you going to do that? When are you going to be, Simon of Cyrene to be the one that helps carry that cross and show?
And that's what solidarity is, right?
Yes, exactly.
I think we're just about out of time. I've got one more question for you, though. And one of the things I wanted to say is just, as I read through this platform, there are, as you'd expect, there are some things where I think like, oh, maybe I wouldn't quite word it the same way. Maybe I don't quite see it in exactly the same lens. But I have no issue, voting for, you as a candidate, because we've had a long discussion here. We agree on all the fundamentals. We have the same. We share a common vision for what human flourishing looks like. And even though, you and I might be able to sort of have an extended discussion on, the economics part of the platform, for example,
Sure.
Again, the common vision, the common foundation is what's incredibly important. And I just dream of a day in which we have more people in the halls of Congress, state legislatures, governor's seats, maybe even the presidency, who share our vision of these things and can have civilized discussions in which, there aren't moral compromises being made, but there are reasoned discussions. There's, empirical evidence weighed to make policy decisions, all in pursuit of this common good that we share a common vision of. And I think that's great. But the final question I have for you, is there a way out of this bipartisan, I would say false political binary into which we've been forced? I mean, I hope the American Solidarity Party is a way out of that. But the third party in America obviously is not a new thing. There have been third parties for as long as we've had a two-party system. And we're still, we find ourselves, I think, just locked in this like ever more vicious and vitriolic cycle in which we're vacillating back and forth every 4 to 8 years between political parties, and we grow to hate each other more. And so one of the things I noticed, again, going back to your platform, in the civic engagement section, you have a part in here that says the House of Representatives and the lower houses of state legislatures should be elected by a system of proportional representation, which is a much more sort of European parliamentary style idea. And then you also say all elections should be held using either a ranked choice system or approval voting, which is, again, something that you find more in sort of European parliamentary style systems of government. So can you talk about that maybe in the context of how we sort of get past this political false binary choice that we have to make every 4 years, and talk about what the future could look like in maybe we're being optimists, but what's the way out if there is one?
Yeah, that's a great question. And obviously, again, it's something that we talk about constantly. I think the great opportunity we have is that if you look at the libertarians and that they're the third party right now. You mentioned that earlier, that your friend would say, well, why not Joe Jorgensen of the Libertarian Party? But in kind of polling and research, again, the number of people who are liberal in that capitalist sense and liberal on social issues consistently is very small. It could be under 10% of the population, which is what they'll get, as a fully fleshed out party at this point that's been around for 50 years, since the 70s, that they're going to get the people that believe that. They're actually going to be able to, they're on, I think, all 50 ballots. And so the people who want that are going to vote for it. And the fact that they're out there trying to get more people, the data actually doesn't support that they can get any more people, right? Because those people don't exist.
Yep.
As for us, we started in 2016, let's say, as the first time official presidential candidate that was on ballots. And, there's like I said, about 30% of the people that are in our quadrant. And if we were able to get all of those people as a third party to take notice, that would immediately change the mindset of the major two parties, because then they would never win 50% they would never have a mandate in anything. And so what would then happen is perhaps the movement would happen for us to have ranked choice voting or approval voting, a system of voting where it's not a winner take all proposition, which forces then parties to cooperate. There's got to be coalitions that are built. And so part of the reason that we have so much vitriol and so much distance between the parties is they don't need to cooperate in order to win the elections around the country. Like the state legislature races and the House of Representatives and the Senate. Like they can have seats that'll fluctuate in their like you were saying, 25% core people. Then you have the fringe people that they're stealing really from our quadrant, and winning seats, and then they just have the gridlock that exists because there's no reason to give or take, and whoever's in power gets to do what they want for 4 years. But then the people in our quadrant will switch over and flip to the other side and give them a chance, and that's really what's going on there, because the core people are not changing. And so if we take over that spot, in my opinion, again, it's a hope, right? It's a dream. That's what it's a third party. You kind of have that vision and mindset. Is that if we like really take that control of that location and hold on to our own people, it may draw the two parties back towards us to try to get those people back. Right now, the Republicans are not stealing from the Democrats directly, or vice versa. They're stealing from people who are not part of either group, and most of those people are with us.
I share your optimism. Maybe it's naive, but I share it, and I hope that we can work towards that better future. I will say, Amar, you'll be happy to know that my wife and I are both casting our votes for the American Solidarity Party. You're on the ballot here, so you're not even just improved writing candidate. You're actually on our ballot. We got our ballots in the mail, and I opened it up to make sure, and there you are, you and Brian. So we'll be casting our vote. We look forward to doing that. I'd like to encourage my listeners to read up more on the American Solidarity Party. I think what Amar and his team is up to is really, really good stuff. I encourage you to go to their website, solidarity-party.org, and I will link to it on the website here as well. And I just love the platform as well. You can see that right on their website, and you can read through all those things, how the American Solidarity Party, I think, really strikes a really good third way that breaks the binaries into which we often let ourselves fall in political discourse, and articulates a vision forward for the common good of everyone in our country, which is really important, and what politics ultimately is all about. Well, Amar, that's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for joining this episode of the podcast. I really enjoyed speaking with you and picking your brain about the party, the platform, the way ahead. I wish you the best in the election. I know that victory is not within grasp, but I hope that we can at least get these ideas out there and get people thinking about a better way forward, and maybe 10, 20, maybe even 50 years hence, these ideas can be really a huge part of reshaping the conversation around so many issues that are near and dear to many of us.
Well, thanks, Zach, for having me on, and thank you for your support and giving me the opportunity to speak to your listeners.
Absolutely. Have a good night, Amar. Thank you.